I don't know about you guys, but this month has flown by very quick. Can't believe it's already the 21st. Okay. So the topic we're going to go into, and again, today I'm just going to give an introduction to it so that we kind of have some general outlines of what we're going to do, is over probably the next 2 weeks, we'll be talking about conflict resolution. And there's really three areas of conflict resolution that we're going to talk about. The first two are pretty specific to the group settings, starting with couples therapy up to relapse prevention, trauma groups. So it really has to deal with uh, two clients that you're working, two or more clients that you're working with at the same time. And the two types that we're going to be talking about is mediation and moderation. Okay. The difference between these two is in mediation, your goal is to get your conflicting group members onto the same page by openly listening to both sides and providing some potential solutions that would be amicable to both parties. Okay. And then moderation is where maybe the group is really young, they haven't created cohesiveness yet. And so basically, what you tell the group members is give me your side, you give me your side, and I'll make the decision on what the outcome is going to be. Okay. And usually moderation is used when you're just barely developing the group and the group members don't know each other well. And then as the group goes along, you transition to a mediation. Okay. Now, these can be two topics in and of themselves. Once you guys get your degree and you get if it's necessary, your professional licenses or whatnot, you can go get additional training in mediation and moderation. And so, for example, you can then a lot of individuals, instead of using a court with a judge on civil cases, they'll go into mediation where a trained mediator helps the parties come to a conclusion. If you read a lot of like your uh, loans for a car, loans on a house, all those kinds of things, it always talks about you can't take the organization to court. You have to take the organization through mediation first. So if, for example, you get ripped off on a car from the financial place, in most situations, you have to go through a mediation process before you can actually really file in the court system for any conflicts. Read the fine print is what I have to say on that. But in our field, the majority of mediation is usually done, for example, when child custody cases, domestic violence cases, and the husband and wife just are not able to come to some agreement. You can enter into a mediation relationship. Sometime, dependent upon the court, they actually might ask you to moderate it, where both parties tell you their side, and you then present to the court a plan. So I'm just saying this because these techniques can be used both in the therapeutic setting, but there's also actually some income potential if you wanted to, if you kind of find these skills kind of interesting. That's another potential kind of uh, way of making some extra money or some money if you're going to develop your own practice or something like that. Anyways, beyond that, now what about the individual setting where you're working with a specific client and it's you and the client? Okay, this is where when we get into conflict resolution, we talk about working with the difficult client, or working with the term that we probably should use more often is working with the resistant client. Okay. And so that'll be kind of our last part to wrap this up is what do you do when you have a client, whether it's in the group setting or the individual setting, that they're just resistant to the treatment. Okay. And this is where it was brought up last time. I'm trying to remember. I think it was Isabel brought it up. This is where sometimes you have to make the difficult decision that maybe this client isn't for you. Maybe that your relationship is just not amicable enough that they would be better with a different social worker, a different therapist, and the like. So the end part of this is, yes, there are times uh, where it's just not going to work out. And so what we need to talk about that in the final conversation about that is we still have the responsibility to make sure that services are served to the client. And how do you make that smooth transition from you to another provider? And that's kind of an art in and of itself, because if, especially coming from a resistant client, if they already have a blemished view of their experience with you, and now you're saying, well, look, let's have you be seen by someone else, you got to finesse that, or else you might lose the client and they might continue to suffer from whatever they came to you in the first place to try and serve. In the case of people who are forced into treatment groups, such as drug and alcohol treatment groups, it might mean they have to go and suffer in prison or in jail because they just were not able to transition from you to another more suitable provider. And so we will talk about, what can we do to try and make that smooth transition. So these are going to be our three areas of discussion over the next couple of weeks: mediation, moderation, and working with resistant clients. Okay. And just to provide a little bit of definition, okay, when we talk about conflict resolution overall, we're talking about it's a way for two or more parties to find peaceful solutions to disagreement. And again, your role in the first two examples will be to mediate or moderate those relationships or those disagreements between two or more individuals. In the third role, it's where you actually are having conflict with the client, which we're going to talk about in the guise of you could put this conflict resolution, because at times the therapist is actually creating the conflict, but we'll generally state this as the resistant client, okay? But we do have to go use all of those skills we've learned so far to make sure that we're not causing that conflict. And I want you to think about this first part of this class that we've talked about. You have to start with those skills so that you're not the one that is causing the conflict, okay? And so that's an important statement to make at this moment. Oh, looks like an airplane flying over. Hold on just a second. All right, I think it's far away. Sorry about that. I couldn't hear myself talk. I hope you guys understand. All right. So this might be a no duh slide, is why should we resolve conflict? Okay. To come to an agreement that is benefits all parties. That's the mediation process. Excuse me. To understand more about whose ideas, beliefs, and backgrounds may differ from our own and between the conflicting parties. Usually, conflict occurs between clients and between the therapist and client because of a difference in belief systems, difference in ideas and values. And I'll bring up a really good, I don't want to say this is a really good example, a clear-cut example is what I should say in this example, is I was once working with a therapist who was very, very Christian. Okay. In her office, she kept a Bible and a cross and all of those things. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And I want to make this, I'm not making a value base on that person's belief system. But one time, this was working with children who were sexually abused, and this therapist was assigned to the parents. And the parents openly said they were atheists. Um, and the therapist started with, in the therapy room with these individuals, purposely setting out a Bible in very plain view of the clients. Okay. And then as the relationship went on, the individual started bringing out the Bible and doing quotes out of it. Okay. So if you can imagine, this created a conflict between belief systems. In this case, it was between the therapist and the client. Okay. So in that situation, because it was so blatant, and this is why I'm using it as an example, it was so blatant, we used a moderation process where I went and I heard the client, I heard the therapist, and I made the decision as the clinical director of what to do. Obviously, well, I'm not going to say obviously. In some of those situations, and I want to make this clear, you can come to some resolution and still make a successful therapeutic relationship. In this situation, the belief system that the therapist held were so strong that it was necessary for me to move that client to a different therapist. Okay. And that's just that the reason why I bring up that example is it's a blatant example of conflict that is created because of two different belief systems and two different backgrounds. Okay. Um, to ensure that the relationship with the opponent continues to grow. And this is specific to the group setting. Again, we're talking two or more individuals within this setting. So this is with doing couples therapy, for example, clear up to doing uh, treatment groups with survivors and addiction issues. Um, and the idea is that it should be, if you want to think about this, conflict is a necessary thing for change. And conflict sometimes is a really, really helpful tool in the therapy session. In fact, when you do things like challenging thoughts, which we'll get into when we get into relapse prevention, when you get into self-definition and identity, when you're talking about trauma clients and getting them to understand that their trauma doesn't define them, that can be very, very conflictual moments for a lot of individuals who have experienced trauma. Okay. Um, and making it so that there is this continued growth and you don't waste that conflict on just making each of the two parties feel good about it, that it becomes a learning moment, and not only for those two or those few, but in the group setting for the entire group. And to find a peaceful solution to difficult situations, this is the modeling part that therapists do in conflict resolution, is how do you, instead of running to the bottle, instead of becoming more violent, instead of having a trauma triggered response, how do you make conflict end in a peaceful, productive way? And those are the things that we will be discovering over the next couple weeks. And I just want to go over the basic steps. We're going to differentiate these steps as we move along between mediation, moderation, and working with difficult clients so that we can kind of see the difference of each of these and where each of these come into place. So the first step in understanding conflict is to understand the conflict. Okay. When we're talking about between clients, for example, And I'm going to use a simple example. I'm going to bring up the example of, let's say you're doing couples therapy. Okay. Completely and fully understanding the husband's perspective and fully and completely understanding the wife's perspective is the start of understanding. Okay. This does take a lot of self-awareness on your part. Okay. I'll bring up the example of, let's say you're a female, and not to say this happens with everyone, but let's say you're very much a person who supports female rights, women's rights, and all of those things. You may want to consider on the self-awareness thing that you have to practice more impartiality on the situation. Meaning that this is when we've been talking about with emotional intelligence, this may be an area where you may need to have some self-awareness that you may be impartial to one party versus the other. And I'll say the same thing for the guys on the male therapist end, is if they have a bias towards, I see this memes on Facebook about, men deserving more rights to see their children, that they play an important role, and all of those things. And you've always felt like maybe it was always unfair in these situations that men in their perception are the ones that lose out. Okay. Understanding those attitudes and beliefs that you have is a starting point of understanding conflict, making sure that you're self-aware of your own biases. All right. And if even when we go into group uh, situations, let's say you yourself are a recovering addict, and you notice that two clients who are conflicting, one took your path to recovery, but the other one is arguing about their path, and they're conflicting on this. Okay. Understanding that because you relate more with one individual because of your personal experience is you need to make sure you have a level of self-awareness that is going on. Okay. Um, the reason why I bring this up is because this first starting point tends to be the number one reason that therapists and social workers cannot resolve conflict. Okay. Because they don't truly listen to and attend to both parties' situation, and they don't allow themselves to be this kind of external party looking into the situation. They tend to bias themselves based on their own beliefs and value systems. Okay. Communicate with the opposition. All right. So once you have a good understanding of the conflict, making sure that both sides get to hear what the other one has. In some instances, this means you going to the party, the opposing party, and saying, so this is another position that you may want to think about. Okay. Um, this one is kind of tricky because you don't want to listen to the client from an opposing party and just kind of say, well, according to Joe, this is what he said about what you just explained. Okay. I want you to think about when people do that. Like, I see this with coworkers all the time when the supervisor comes and you explain something that you're doing, and they kind of go, well, Joe over there, he does it this way. And he thinks the way you're doing it is ridiculous. I don't know if you've ever seen this in the workplace, but it really makes the person feel like their opinion is devalued. Okay. So when communicating the opposition, if you can't get the oppositions to communicate their differences and you have to do that for them, then making it so it's almost coming from a third party, that it's not even coming from that opposing party is important. because more than likely what you'll see is the opposing party having some aha moments. Oh, I never thought about it that way. I didn't think of, but once you say, well, this is what your opposing party said, walls instantly go up. Okay. Um, brainstorming, brainstorming possible resolutions. So this is when you bring the two parties together and say, going with the situation we talked about, saying something like, so I've talked to both of you. We've talked about some opposing points of views and stuff like that. Um, let's brainstorm some solutions to this situation. Let's talk about what are the possible solutions. Okay. And if this does not occur, and nothing can be talked about, this is where you go into what's called use of impartial mediators. Okay. In the group setting, when you have more than two individuals, you could use one of the other group members or a group of the other group members to say, okay, this is a conflict between Joe and Bill. This is what they both said. What do you all think we could do that would resolve these issues? But that does have to deal with the level at which those two parties are now communicating at. If they're not communicating at all and they both shut down, using the group is a bad idea. So in this case, what you'd want to do is you yourself want to become the mediator and say, okay, gang, I've listened to both sides, and I want you to both agree that whatever solution that I come up with, I want you guys to agree on it. But that's not where it stops for you as an impartial mediator, because you want to then ask, what are some alternatives? We've tried to talk about solutions. What are some alternatives that you would like me to explore as I try to make a decision on what we can do here? Okay, so in the beginning, you started with brainstorming, and if you hit roadblocks there, then you go into the impartial mediator stage where you say, okay, do you both agree that I'll make the decision of what's going on? And then, but that's not where you close them off. You then go into, okay, I've heard both of you. What are some alternatives that we could agree on that would satisfy both parties? Okay. And then you help them through the decision situations. These last two is about using the skills that we've already learned, okay, that we've already gone through. Is throughout this process, you want to cope with stressful situations and pressure tactics on your end, okay? But you also need to provide those coping skills to the individuals, okay? And so this is where, for example, I'll use an anger management situation where two individuals are starting to get angry with each other because they're just at such disagreement with each other. Um, uh, and so you start saying, okay, you guys are getting heightened frustration and anger with each other. What are some skills we've learned that you guys can implement right now to make it so you don't make any bad decisions with your emotions and with your anger? Okay. And so, one, you could use skills that have already been talked about in your group. Or again, you can make it a learning opportunity and say, okay, what are some things that we can do right now to take the pressure down, take the emotions down? What do you all think we could do at this moment? And and I'll tell you, this is where you can use other group members, because they always come up with wonderful ideas like, let's take a break and gather our thoughts. Let's do a different activity. Let's and distract ourselves and come back to this later. In the couple setting, it's about literally letting each member go to a separate room for a minute and let them kind of calm down and come back together. Okay. And then, of course, the last thing that we hope to get to is to choose the best resolution. What is the best outcome for this situation? And again, I'm hoping that I'm expressing that these steps look wonderfully easy, and it's going to be a kumbaya moment, and everything is going to work out okay. I don't want that message sent at this point. When we enter into the realm of heightened human emotions and individuals are getting into the fight or flight mode of physiological reaction and things are getting heated. This is not something that is easy. And I want to express that to a point that while I'm explaining these in very simple terms, this is not an easy task to do. But with that being said, again, I'll say this, as long as you've used the skills that we've been learning and you've built those relationships, when conflict does arise, it's much easier to deal with. Okay. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about these things. And we will talk about what if the client is resistant from the beginning, where you haven't had the opportunity to build these skills. So we will talk about that. But again, I just want to emphasize the point. The starting point is what we've learned so far. And let me close this. I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to stop sharing. I told you all this would be a short one because it's just an introduction. But what I want you all to think about between now and next Tuesday, because I know you all have either professional experience with conflicts